Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. James and I are very proud to stand here, open up the government in defense of this motion, because we understand a crucial fact about democracies, and that is that they derive their legitimacy from the widespread social perception of the legitimacy of those institutions themselves. And you lose that legitimacy when it becomes clear to the population, or at least large chunks of the population, that there is a special cultural and political class of elites that govern them, that don't share their values, but would foist those values upon them. We think that's unhealthy for democracy. We think it's something we oppose on our side of the House. I want to be clear really quickly from the top about what exactly we are and are not defending. Because of the special language of the motion, we are not defending referenda to replace legislatures full stop. We're saying that they need to be allowed. So oddly, the burden is upon the opposition to say that they're not allowable in any instance. I'll be very clear about why we say they are allowable in the particular instance we're going to be defending. The particular instance is this. In symbolic, cultural, and social issues, we think that public referenda make a terrific amount of sense. In other issues where technocratic and empirical expertise is relevant, such as managing budgets, education policy, things like that, we think that those policies should be largely relegated to the legislature. But in large issues of social, cultural, symbolic importance, we think that instead, the will of the people directly should be dispositive. What am I talking about? Questions of abortion, questions of the death penalty, questions of like Christmas policies, which Bill O'Reilly always seems to be worried about, which are just exclusively the domain of culture. There might be like measurements of trees and that kind of thing that are involved, but we think we can handle that. All of those things we think should be taken care of at the level of the democratic plebiscite of the people. Any questions on the law? Or my interpretation of the framework? You guys seem to be upset about it. Are you okay now? Yeah. Okay, good. All right, so that's what our burden is. Our burden is to say that it's preferable for democracies in general that those things be handled by plebiscite, the rest can be handled by legislatures. 3 points I'm going to bring to you out of my speech. The first is simply why this is more consistent with democratic principles in a society and why these issues in particular need to be represented in this way. Second is how you get better outcomes on those policies in particular. And third is how it improves democratic discourse in general. So let's start with the first. Democratic virtues or democratic principles that are upheld. We think that it is substantively anti-democratic to presume that because you come from a particular political culture, and I would grant that all of us come from this political culture, at least in the United States and our respective countries, but that there's no basis upon which to believe that your views on abortion or gay marriage are preferable simply on the basis of culture to those of the people that disagree with you. And in a democracy, we don't live in a theocratic, a secular theology where your interpretation of reality has like prima facie importance over that of the people. We think that particularly on these issues, when you cannot presume that you are right because the questions are of a subjective and cultural nature, there is an obligation to defer to the people themselves on these questions. To do anything other than that is cultural elitism at its worst, by definition, whether or not it's a culture that we happen to agree with in this room. Go ahead.
So do you think this referendum should take precedence over things like Supreme Court rulings on whether or not marriage is acceptable?
On the question of courts, we think that's neutral in this House. The question for this debate is between legislatures, and plebiscites, okay? I can't get into a debate about, we're not invalidating courts in general because obviously they get involved in social issues from time to time. That's simply not a part of this debate. It's whether, when we're choosing between legislatures or plebiscites in these social issues, we think it's always preferable to go with plebiscites. Okay, so we think that there's something that's just inconsonant about having the people and their will as a majority overruled on the basis of cultural justifications as opposed to empirical justifications when they're fully able to do so. So we think that that's the first point. We are consistent with the democratic principle on an issue where that democratic principle should hold sway more so than any kind of elitism. Second issue, better outcomes on policy. I just want to walk through a few examples and explain why we think that it's a better outcome when you actually have a plebiscite as opposed to having a policy manufactured by the legislature. So for instance, in terms of abortion, when you have the legislature right now trying to determine issues of abortion, we think that it becomes unnecessarily radicalized, and moderate positions are not allowed, that could be allowed through the framing of plebiscite issues that could win a plurality or a majority within that state. So for example, right now in Arkansas, we just had a full ban on abortion put forward, okay? That's obviously a very polarized conservative position. Likewise, when Obama was in the Illinois state legislature, he passed laws that didn't allow for the Infant Born Alive Act. He actually abstained on the issue because he thought it might hurt his liberal credentials. The legislature polarizes these social issues because people are worried about rising up through the inner ranks of their own party, which are governed by a specific set of cultural assumptions. So very moderate people in politics in the legislature have to take more extreme partisan cultural positions in order to show their allegiance to that particular set. We think that's really, really pernicious for the political process. We prefer a plebiscite because polls show you the vast majority of Americans, for instance, and I would guess the same is true in Europe and other countries, don't think abortion is okay in the first trimester, but feel pretty queasy about it in the second and third trimesters. And we think reasonable moral policy that is moderate could be set up on that basis, but we've been prevented from doing so. We think the legislature's having control, even in a hypothetical where Roe v. Wade were in place, would be less preferable than it is right now, okay? So that's in terms of just abortion, not at this time. Secondly, in terms of gay marriage, and this is really key, I think, because gay marriage is a really good litmus test of this policy, which would be preferable. If you believe that the option you should pursue if you're trying to advance the cause of gay marriage is to play power politics and try to pay off politicians and to create lobbyist groups, and that's how you're going to win this cause, you're dead wrong. The best thing we can do on cultural and social issues is to put the impetus on political players to persuade their neighbors and engage in the act of political conversion. Because only then will you actually have a healthy democratic shift. If you don't do that, there will always be a minority of people, or even a substantial minority of people, who believe that these cultural issues were forced down them. It will increase resentment and increase resistance to that movement itself. We think that political conversion is key on the issue of gay marriage. So to the extent that we can emphasize and get people to buy into the idea that plebiscites are the way you must handle cultural and social issues, we think that's preferable. James will take 2 POIs because I messed up. Go ahead.
So we have recently seen in the polls in America a radical shift in terms of opinions on gay marriage. Do you not think it is particularly vulnerable that the plebiscites that you discuss are so easily manipulatable in terms of giving them this much power in the legislature?
So you don't want them to have power in the legislature? I'm not sure how that has any bearing on what I said. I think that obviously it's a fact, and it just substantiates the point that I'm making, that efforts to change public attitudes through TV shows, through political conversion, through changing people's minds can have dramatic effects. And that's a reason why plebiscites right now in California would likely uphold gay marriage. We think that all of our efforts should be pushed in that direction. Last point that I want to get into, in terms of improving democratic discourse, we think we increase buy-in for socially marginalized groups, particularly social conservatives who would otherwise be alienated by policies they believe were foisted upon them and that had no democratic will. But it changes their understanding of the society they live in when you can point to the fact that a majority of their neighbors, not the government itself, but a majority of their neighbors were the ones that supported this particular policy. If they believe, as Rush Limbaugh and Glenn Beck and everyone else would tell them, that these policies are foisted on them by a liberal globalist elite as opposed to their neighbors next door, it changes their buy-in to their own society and the likelihood that they'll change their own views. Democracy is healthier when we have people actually buying in, and that's what we propose.
I thank the speaker for his speech, and to open to the opposition house recognizes the leader of office.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I would say ladies and gentlemen, but just gentlemen. James opens with a wonderful introduction about the power that individuals ought to have in the democratic process. His entire first argument is about the crucial role that he thinks individual citizens should play in the decision-making of government. He then jettisons all of that analysis in giving us a model, literally before he even gets to a constructive argument, by saying that none of that quote-unquote important, valuable contribution should exist in the way of actual policy or questions of taxation or governance or government policy, but rather should exclusively apply to these more ethereal cultural questions. I don't think that he actually supports much of the rhetoric in his case with his arguments. So first of all, a little bit of rebuttal. He says that we want this to be on the issues surrounding the death penalty or surrounding Bill O'Reilly's fictional war on Christmas. So I point out that in those instances we're talking about constitutional rights, whether the death penalty is constitutionally permissible, whether free speech rights are unjustifiably infringed through the limitation of Christmas scenes, nativity scenes, for instance. I suggest to you those are the worst kind of issues for citizens to directly have a say on. Furthermore, I think of nothing more degrading to the democratic process than a national Bill O'Reilly-run plebiscite on the war on Christmas. But furthermore, he then gives you this first argument about democratic principles. He says that citizens can often be right. And I guess the question I would pose to the second speaker and the rest of the government bench is, I agree, but why can those citizens not elect suitable representatives to go to Washington, to go to a state house, and represent those views to the legislature, to the executive branch? I don't understand why those legislators are so incompetent they would act in ways that are outside the public interest, that are outside the interest of those citizens who elected them. Secondly, he talks about policy outcomes. He says, Arkansas tried to pass a full ban on abortion. So, like getting back to what I said earlier, I think this is literally just a constitutional question. I don't think this is something you should give individual citizens the power to initiate referenda on. No, thank you. But the second part of this argument, he says, is that politicians can't really go there They can't take those kind of extreme positions because they will be marginalized. I suggest to you I'm quite happy for extremist views in our politics on both the left and the right to be tempered through the lens of partisanship. For individuals who would espouse those views to have to recognize that they will have consequences beyond themselves, and therefore for those views, no thank you, to have less credence in the process. He then indicates this is crucially important on the issue of gay marriage, and I'll take you in a second. But this only cuts to the heart of what I'm going to get at in my constructive material on opposition, in that those majorities can be fleetingly transient. If we had this debate just 5 or 7 years ago, and there was a national plebiscite in America on gay marriage, there may well have been a national constitutional amendment to ban the practice. I suggest to you that you have far better outcomes when you temper the will of the Democratic majority through legislators, which our side does. Go ahead, back up.
The government's argument was that the people are often more moderate than legislators who are forced to toe a party line or else lose the support of their party. Doesn't this mean that by deferring to the people, we get less extremist outcomes because we allow the moderates to be heard?
Look, if they are forced to toe an extremist party line, that's not because there exists an extremist position somewhere in the political spectrum. It's because lots of people, which your side is empowering, remember, take that position. I support the idea that politicians should have to temper that belief through the lens of partisan politics. Moving constructively, I think representative democracy is better than direct democracy for a number of reasons. I don't think it's better just because individuals can't all get together and participate in direct democracy, because we live in a society that's obviously far too large for that to happen. I think it's better because it actually causes the kind of discourse and discussion that is productive, and I have 6 reasons why. First, individual people that vote in these referendums are not accountable for broad societal consequences that occur. They might like the outcome, but they might not like what will happen 10 years down the line. They might not like what happens to their neighbor, but they're not accountable to their neighbor in the same way that a legislator is. Secondly, individual people who vote in these often lack any detailed policy expertise. I understand James tried to get around this in the model, but I do think that if it's going to have any substantive bearing on the actual outcomes of policies in America, you have to allow citizens to have some kind of effect on policy, otherwise the debate is meaningless. I think that individuals don't consider initiatives separately. At least with a representative, there is a buffer of thought between the decision and the outcome that happens. That individual is required by the nature of their employment, by the nature of their position in our public discourse, to seriously contemplate their decisions and their votes, which individuals are not. I also think that negotiation and compromise are essential in legislatures in crafting an agenda. Bills that are brought before the floor have to have support, usually from both parties. I suggest that kind of brokering and deal-making leads to better legislation, leads to legislation that has far more compromise than you would get in a referendum process, James.
Okay, right now, the vast majority of states and countries deal with the death penalty through their legislatures. We're saying in every case that should be dealt with through a plebiscite. Why would it not be preferable, or why do the state governments have more epistemic access to the moral issues surrounding the death penalty than their people?
Because individuals that vote in those legislatures have access to legislative committees that can call broad swathes of experts on issues and hear the actual informed opinion. Opinions that citizens often don't seek out. Opinions that are overcrowded in the public discourse by the Bill O'Reillys, by the Rush Limbaughs, by the very people that side government empowers. Lastly, I suggest that even if individual people are not particularly interested in the outcome of a referendum, they feel the need, because they're in the voting booth and it's presented to them, to make a choice. I think that leads to a lot of voting that is certainly less than optimal. Secondly, I want to talk about legislative coherence, because I think that legislatures that are elected by individuals could be seeking to achieve an outcome. A legislature could be seeking to implement the death penalty, while at the very same time, those same people who voted for those legislators are voting to not have the death penalty or some completely incoherent policy outcome. For instance, in California, where they vote for increased educational funding and lower taxes, and therefore bankrupt the state. I suggest to you, Mr. Speaker, this is likely what happens when individuals are not directly responsible for the long-term and societal consequences of their vote, but are merely directly concerned with the short-term impact on themselves. Lastly, and Vito's going to go into this far more, this actually hugely empowers special interest groups, where market incentives often line up directly on one side of the question, allowing those interests to hijack the debate without the room for an effective opposition that the political spectrum and legislatures provide. Mr. Speaker, we provide an effective check against the worst extremes of a Democratic majority, and we think that's a good thing. We were very proud to oppose.
I thank the Speaker for his speech, and to continue peace in government, the House recognizes the Deputy Prime Minister.
I guess the awkward team line is flashing our cute puppies at you, so I'm about that. I actually picked his puppy, but then he took it from me. Speaker points against my partner. So I find the sort of speech that we get from the leader of the opposition problematic. There's fundamentally a refusal to engage in the substance and the merits of the model that were laid out. I think we largely sidestep the issues that you're concerned with by clarification of the model, which I'd like to do now. Then I'll answer your substance, and then I'm going to talk about sort of increased notions of civic engagement, responsibility, and sort of social, cultural, political life, things like that. But initially, we think that it's important that the model is only on the question of cultural issues, cultural clash, things like that, things that aren't determined by things like going back to the Constitution. That solves your qualms about the public suddenly doing referenda on issues of national defense, or how we will do the budget, or how we will fund schools in California, things like that. We intentionally sidestep that. That also solves all of your arguments about committees. So I don't think that you really get this. In fact, you note it in your substantive matter why those are important. When we talk about the issues of cultural clash, these are things that are explicitly not discussed within the Constitution, which answers the next argument that you provided. There's not a clear litmus test within the Constitution of how to handle issues such as civil unions, such as abortion, such as the death penalty, right? That's why we need to appeal to the sort of cultural spirit that's going on in civic discourse throughout the United States, rather than having a sort of top-down implementation of a cultural shift from the legislature. We think that ultimately leads to more radicalization, more disenfranchisement, and a worse political environment instead of an organic sort of bottom-up appeal of what the people want. And we even outlined issues on which that would take place. The death penalty is very indicative here. They say that we should have better political officials, right? And there's just really no warranting there that matches up against the Killa's warranting, right? So the Killa explains how right now bipartisan politics actually causes a polarization of parties so that they can have staunch party lines, right? There's a radicalization on issues such as abortion because of the polarizing effects of legislation. This also happens in gay marriage. That means that there's not genuine political conversion or anything like that. There's only an increased amount of resentment on the part of the public. And in addition, it means that there's no middle road policies that are being enacted by legislature, which answers the question that you put to all of the members on the government.
The issue is that the questions on these ballots are not worded in a moderate way.
yes,
They're often worded in extremely polarizing ways as well, which leads to all the harms you're talking about, without the chance of moderate politicians actually tempering and having influence.
Well, so the second part of your question, I think we've already answered, that there aren't such moderate politicians that exist in the status quo. But secondly, our claim is that the plebiscite could have more moderate approaches to those issues. I also think that my extension, when I talk about how notions of expertise or committees, specifically when applied to issues of cultural context, actually make us less moderate, make us less informed, things like that. But I think you should also note that we think there's no reason why we should defer or prefer the sort of expertise of politicians or members of the legislature on issues of cultural value. That sort of determination needs to happen within the public. It's not a question of expertise or knowledge of national defense or how many top secret security access clearance doohickeys you have. Rather, it's just how you think the spirit of the nation feels on questions such as gay rights, such as abortion, right? And there's why risk the rolling of the die with an increasingly polarized legislature when you can ask the public directly, which is what we support. They say that people are fleeting in their opinion, but we think that this actually isn't the case. There are sort of general shifts that happen throughout the public culture. This happens continuously throughout our history. Things like civil rights, women's rights. There's a general progressivism that exists within liberal democracies that we think needs to be implemented from the bottom up as opposed to the top down. But more importantly, this notion that the public cannot be trusted, that we are all too fleeting, all too willy-nilly and precarious, is a sort of cynical distance that actually diminishes our democratic participation, which I'll talk about more explicitly in my split. There also wasn't really refutation of Kilcutt's last point, that we need to increase the amount of buy-in that radicals have in politics so that they aren't cynical and distant and think that values are being foisted on them. They say committees are good. Again, we do not eviscerate committees. We simply think and warranted why committees aren't critical on questions of cultural import. We also think that we solve a misinformed public by discussing civic engagement or having more engagement, which I'll talk about in 1 second. We solve issues such as educational funding. The last argument was that there's going to be this sort of abuse of the public by the media, but this argument doesn't take into account things like lobbies, which can manage to do that to the legislature. Massive amounts of money is thrown in to fund these people within the legislature, but as opposed to one person being misinformed and overfunded, we allow the whole public to make those deliberations, which we think is not only more organic, but also more sustainable. In the context of cultural issues, I think expertise is bad. That's my split. I think that it ultimately diminishes the responsibility as well as the social life of liberal democracies. Notions of expertise and specialization, while fruitful in areas of complexity, are ultimately harmful to issues of social and cultural import. To be explicit, those ideas of expertise are intimately associated with politics, and that causes a disengagement and disenfranchised public where we defer it. I don't need to vote in on the question of abortion. I'll let a doctor make that determination for me. Please.
But even on the question of the death penalty, there are serious issues surrounding the effect those drugs have on the system of the person who is being executed before they indeed die. Isn't that something that's worth considering and not something that's likely to be considered in a public plebiscite?
Our argument is that a public plebiscite will actually cause more consideration of those things to happen, as opposed to just legislators consider this stuff for me because I'm not part of the political process. We think you ultimately lead a withering away of democratic discourse. The ultimate threat to democratic discourse, the foremost threat to our institutions, is apathy, is disenfranchisement. Today we live in an age of cynical distance. The zeitgeist of incredulousness is something that is ultimately drying up the veins of our political body. We think that's ultimately harmful. People should care about the drugs that are enacted on people who are going to die anyway. And if I'm a bit cynical on that, that's okay, because you can rally against me in a world in which we have more dialogue, more debate, things like that, as opposed to just, you know, somewhere else, outside of my house, outside of my neighborhood, outside of my city, people will make these decisions for me. Politics happens elsewhere. That disenfranchisement is not democratic, and more importantly, it's irresponsible. It's something that means that we don't actually have to have oversight or incredulousness or scrutiny of our institutions. After all, they're experts, they're specialists. I am a lowly master's student of philosophy. But with that being said, Hannah Arendt, interestingly, defines our humanity as our participation in the public space, as politics. It's a shared space of deliberation. The fights that earn the human right to vote should not be taken away by bureaucracy. It's a tentacular form of violence that quells the voices of people on the ground that we think is not only something that leads to polarizing legislature, but also leads to disenfranchisement, leads to other people becoming more radical and thinking that values are being foisted on them, and leads to irresponsibility in areas of cultural import. All you said was that in areas of expertise this should not be done. That's why we have a model that explicitly said we will not do this in areas of expertise such as national defense. I have a cute puppy, which means I won this debate.
I next speak for a speech. And to continue the case of the opposition house recognized the deputy leader of the opposition.
Okay. Someone like, so this may die.
Do you, I have an extra timer. If you
That'd be
want.
great.
Yeah.
Thank Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I don't know how this debate will go. I certainly would not want to play the second speaker on proposition in a game of Scrabble. Those are some intense words. I want to talk about two things. I want to talk firstly about the hugely problematic moral issues that arise from a bill that allows a tiny majority of the population to impose its conception of what is moral and what is just onto the rest of the population. I want to talk about issues with ballots and why I think the perception of how ballot initiatives work is totally wrong for opening government. I then want to refute everything we were coming out of the two speakers. So what are the moral implications of this bill? At a very basic level, I think both legislatures and courts exist as a way that we temper the will of the majority and its ability to impose its conception of what is good and moral onto other people. We think every human being has equal access to some notion of morality and what types of cultural and moral avenues give them meaning and accord to their particular life experiences and values. I don't think any human and any group of people can claim to have a majority on these issues, especially the types of things that government wants to talk about. What are the problems with this type of policy? Essentially, it allows a slim majority of people to impose its will onto the populace on issues like gay marriage, on issues like abortion, in a way that we think is hugely problematic. I think it means that other people's valid conceptions on these issues are necessarily drowned out and without proper consideration for whether or not these things are good. Go ahead, back to
So if those perspectives aren't represented by elected legislators, how are they going to be represented on your side of the House?
Right, so let's talk about why elected legislators are different in the way they actually do this. Because legislatures have to balance different factions in society. when a legislature passes a particular law about a cultural or a moral issue, it needs to factor in the potential alienation of significant minorities in that society, right? It is unable, any politician who is only trying to appeal to a firm base of 51% of the population is pursuing a strategy of political suicide, because he has fixed and narrowed his base to a concrete and unmovable set of voters. But at the point where politicians have an incentive to always appeal even to significant minority groups, they cannot trample on these people's rights in the way that a majority of individual voters could. When individual voters cast their ballot in a ballot initiative, that one individual, multiplied by millions across a state and a country, has no incentive to care about the effects of his policy on minority groups and their moral interests. But a politician, when he casts a vote in the Senate, has an incentive to think about the effects his policy will have on minority groups. And that's a distinction that is very important. No, thank you. I also think at the point where, I think there's a big issue here with things like expertise. That has been an ongoing thing in this debate. We'll concede that there are some issues perhaps that are purely moral, but surely issues like the death penalty do involve things where expertise are important. We're talking about things like the deterrent effect of the death penalty, the effect that it may have on broader social trends and turning people towards crime. These are things that I don't think people have access to that Penner talks about that are important. What are a whole bunch of issues with ballots? How do ballot questions get placed onto election slates? They get placed onto it when you get X number of signatures. When you get X number of signatures for a particular wording of a question, it is placed onto a ballot. That is to say that ballot wordings can influence policies as well. They're often tacked onto the end of normal elections. So you'll vote for politicians, and after voting for politicians, you have like 15 different ballot initiatives placed in front of you. And each one of these is worded in particular ways that can be biased, which means that the way people vote on this may not necessarily be representative of their specific views on the topic, but rather the way a question plays upon them, or the dice to put something on that. There's also a big issue with funding, right? I think that in order to get something placed onto the electoral, the ballot basically, you need to have funding. In order to promote a campaign, you need funding. Now, on cultural and moral issues, I would ask you to consider which groups on the political spectrum have the money and the will to actually fund these extensive campaigns. There aren't the moderates. It's the extremists on these issues who have the largest buy-in in cultural and moral issues who are going to be putting these questions onto ballots. So I think the initiatives that get funding, because keep in mind, the average person on the street does not have the capacity to put a question onto a ballot or to fund an extensive campaign to sway people on his opinion. The people who do this are on the extremist side of the spectrum who have the greatest intensity of preference for that particular topic, and that is the issue that comes about ballot initiatives that necessarily makes them as problematic issues that they talk about. What does proposition tell you? They firstly tell you it's unfair that liberal and conservative elites foist values upon us. I think I've told you three things about this. That this necessarily leads to a tyranny of the majority given the difference in perceptions that a politician has and an individual voter has. But secondly, that legislatures do change to adapt to people's views, right? Recognize that in 2011, we saw 3 senators in the United States in support of gay marriage. In 2013, we're closer to 49. And that is a massive spike, but I think that massive increase shows that they are receptive to people's views. But here's another question. When are they receptive to people's views? A major point on proposition is that people need buy-in, right? They need to feel invested in the types of things that occur. But I actually think that these policies are seen as less legitimate when they're passed by a slim majority of like 50.5% of voters. When legislatures pass policies on these types of things, they do so when there's an expectation that there's a firm electoral base of support for these policies within those countries. That is when they gain the greatest amount of support. That is when I think they're most likely to be powerful. Also, I think expertise, the thing Penner talks to you about, are important. Ballots, I think, have a great deal of elitism anyway, in a way that is not checked by democracy. That's an important thing in this debate. That elites have a great amount of power to influence politics, be they ballots or legislators. But in legislatures, they serve as one among a series of influences that politicians have to care about. Politicians have to care about their accountability to the populace. People don't have to care about their accountability to themselves in that same way. So I think whereas funds from special interests work as one competing interest on a politician, it serves as one of many. It doesn't work that way with people. I'm sorry, you guys have been setting up for a while.
Yeah, okay. So radical groups may be able to write ballot initiatives, but they will never pass. Explain to me why 51% of the population on the death penalty or abortion are going to be extremist radicals more so than their legislature.
Right, so the issue here is, when we say they're radical, right, if people have a marginal preference for one side of the issue, they're more likely to cast a ballot as opposed to abstaining from the vote, I think. I think the flip side of that, the no vote on the death penalty, is even farther away from their view in the ideological spectrum than casting a yes vote. And that's very harmful as well. I also think that there's issues here about the polarization of legislatures in general that they're trying to compare this to. Whereas Penner tells you that when legislatures form party lines, when parties form their general party platforms, it may be the case, and actually this is much less true in the United States than places like Canada. I think senators and congressmen do have a degree of independence from the party line. But even if they didn't, The party line itself has a measure of democracy to it, right? The party line itself has to be responsive to what people think about the way legislators don't have. That's important. He talked about lobbyists. I think that I've talked to you about the distinction between a lobbyist effect on a politician, where he serves as one in a sea of competing interests, in the same way that it does not on a person's ability to be influenced by media votes. Then we heard about apathy. We heard some soaring rhetoric about why we need to engage people in the process. A number of problems here. Firstly, people are apathetic. They are the last types of people you want voting on ballot initiatives. If people are genuinely apathetic and just see a list of 15 things they can vote on, they're going to check off things that don't represent their interest. But mostly, I would ask you to consider whether or not the types of issues that Proposition wants to talk about are issues where we don't already see hugely contentious and hugely rich debates. I don't think it's a lack of debate that is a problem. It's a problem when the majority foists its conception of what is good onto the minority. All those reasons we oppose.
Speak for a speech and to continue to govern the House recognizes the member of government.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think there's a fundamental problem in the way that side opposition thinks about the ways that representative democracies are actually capable of talking about these issues and the extent to which they actually represent the people. But moreover, I think something that we've neglected in this debate is the extent to which representative democracies, even when they may be able to talk about these issues, are incapable of talking about issues that fall out of the discourse entirely. There are agenda-setting functions that happen at the top levels when elites have this type of control that mean that in many cases, the people who are not capable of electing representatives, the people who do constitute the type of minority groups that opening opposition seems to think get so much attention from legislators, actually don't get any at all. I think this is something that's been neglected, and I think it's something that is crucial in understanding why in many cases we need voter-initiated referenda. But before I get to those points, I want to talk about what we heard out of opening opposition. So what Vinu told us, firstly, was that there's a moral problem with voter-initiated referenda. He told us that in many cases, these voter-initiated referenda don't adequately address the needs of minorities. That, in fact, legislators are often going to be more accountable to them, because if they're not going to get elected. This seems to me to be on face absurd. The minority does not elect the legislators. In fact, if the minority constitutes, say, 5 or even 10% of the population, and another 51% of the population does elect those legislators, I'll take you in a second, Vinu, then I think it's really problematic, because these people never have any incentive to care about these parts of the populations. That these people never have the ability to influence these legislators because they are never the ones electing them. Consider, for example, a black minority population in a Republican-dominated district in the United States. Their issues never get heard, but if they have a voter-initiated referenda, they have the ability to get enough signatures on the ballot to make sure other people do talk about these issues, and they'll never be talked about in the legislature. Sure.
The distinction is, since elections are competitions, alienating a particular minority group even has the potential to swing elections event you at the point where they go and vote for your opponents. That's why people have to care about, legislators have to care about.
Unless the majority consistently doesn't care about that group in which you have no incentive to ever care about them. I think the view you give us of representative democracies is far rosier than the reality. There are tons of districts with minorities who never get airtime because they're on the other side of the system. Recognize that party politics influences the way that representation works in all of these countries. That it's impossible to say that parties are fluid enough that they'll change over time and that groups that are marginalized will eventually be able to make their way into the discourse. The reality is that in many cases they don't, and that's a problem. But we also heard from Vinu, I think really problematically, that the problem with voter-initiated referenda is that the issues that get onto ballot initiatives are the ones that are funded by the extremists because they have all the money and they're going to put really radically worded ballot initiatives on the ballots and force people to confront them that way. So, first of all, I would just contest on face the argument that it is easier to get something from a monetary perspective onto a ballot than it is to get someone elected. In fact, I think amassing a few thousand signatures is self-evidently far cheaper than getting someone elected who agrees with you. So given that that's the case, I think if an issue is not getting airtime in the legislature, certainly if that issue is never getting talked about, it's easier to get people to talk about it when all you have to do is get a few thousand signatures from your neighborhood or from your city. And that perspective, then, I think we get far better discourse on our side of the house. But I want to move on to my constructive material, and I want to talk about two things. I want to talk first about why, on a deeper level, we get far better outcomes on our side of the House. I think on opening government, they got it right when they said that party politics changes the way that the legislators engage with these issues, and that in many cases things like lobbying bias the process. But I think there's far more detail that needs to be added to this, and I think there are a number of places in which this occurs. So, first of all, I want to talk about how, on our side of the House, by using voter-initiated referenda, we minimize the harms of the party system. I think they got it right on opening government when they told us that parties are too polarized to actually account for moderate perspectives. That this is why, for example, in the United States, we have a debate about yes or no on abortion, instead of a debate about all the potential middle ground alternatives that more people might agree with. But why is this the case, and why does this type of polarization arise? I think there are a couple of reasons. The first is that in party systems, whether they're two-party or multi-party, people rely on party funding to get on the ballot at all. So unless you toe the party line, you don't get funded. So unless you toe the party line, you cannot get elected. There is no choice. There is no independence. So in these cases, the funding is why you never get attention to these types of moderate perspectives. But I also think it's problematic that in most of these systems where you have party-dominated politics, the majority party in Congress or in Parliament is the one that proposes the legislation. So that party always has an interest in proposing legislation that reflects interests, that the people proposing that legislation are people who are forced to toe the party line. There is literally no one in the legislature to propose the types of moderate alternatives that they seem to think are so prolific in the legislatures. There is a reason that these types of things never get proposed, and it's party politics itself. So we think on our side of the House, when a moderate perspective exists, there is the ability of those who believe it, who we believe on our side constitute a substantial portion of the population, to actually get those passed. I don't think it's true that only extremists want to get their views represented on the ballot. And so if that's the case, and people do care about these issues, we think on our side of the House, we make it far easier for them to do so. I'll take that.
So what you fail to recognize is that just because your party wins an election doesn't mean that it has a majority to pass extremist legislation on its own. There are other parties who get power and can block them. Please deal with that.
So sometimes that's the case, but suppose that's not the case. But even if that isn't the case, though, we think that even though there are competitive parties, and you may have many parties in a parliament, the problem is that if each party is towing its own party line and is unwilling to compromise, as we've seen on issues like abortion in the United States, or on the issue of Euroscepticism in the UK parliament, you do get polarization. You do get an inability to negotiate and to actually reach a middle ground. Our advocacy is this: that there are people who believe in the middle ground, but those people are never the ones who are able to select from the set of party options and get their views represented. But I also think on our side of the House, we do a far better job in franchising minorities. Recognize that we believe that there are single issues that may apply to minority groups in these districts, where the broad populace may agree with the minority on, for example, their religious rights, and would support legislation or a ballot initiative that would allow them to actualize those rights. But because that minority never represents a substantial portion of the electorate, a legislator who's elected never has an incentive to put that at the top of their agenda, so that issue never gets talked about. That's a problem. Another problem, though, we think, is that lobbying, again, results in an agenda-setting effect where the issues that people actually care about never get talked about. I think this is something that got touched on at opening, but needs more development. We think, on our side of the House, that lobbying allows people who have direct access to legislators, who have more money, to give money and use this time to actually buy access, to buy the right for their issue to go to the top of the ballot. Given that once you are in office, all that matters for getting reelected, given the advantages of incumbency, is just that you get money, then you have every incentive to appease the lobbyists who can go fund your campaign. And so that's why these issues get talked about, but the ones that the broad populace and the moderates care about don't. Look, we think that the reason that representative democracies exist is out of convenience. It's not because representatives are better or smarter, it's because in many cases we need them. But in cases where we don't, there's a clear reason not to.
I thank the speaker for his speech, and to continue the opposition House recognizes a member of opposition.
Mr. Speaker, it might just be that I come from a radically different kind of society, but the fact of the matter is that my society holds a lot of very strange beliefs. Number one, the majority of my society believes that rape ought not to be a crime, particularly if that rape is corrective. Number two, the majority of my society believes that gay marriage ought not to be legalized, despite the fact that the South African Constitution protects that. These are the kinds of people that are ignored by the government side of the House because they give an overly generous picture about the nature of the kinds of individuals that make decisions within referenda. To this regard, we're going to give 3 lines of extension on the great case given to us by opening opposition. Thank you, Hot House. You guys are fantastic. Number 1, we're going to tell you why we think governments are in a better place than individuals to act on behalf of people's interests, rather than just simply to represent their preferences. Number 2, we're going to tell you why it's problematic to have people themselves dictating the agenda, even if we buy into the analysis that we don't, from the government side of the house, that people are capable of setting the agenda and lobbyists just somehow get lost under their system. Number 3, we're going to tell you why we don't think it's ever okay to give people the idea that you've legitimized their laws and their preferences only in cases where those preferences are correct, objectively speaking. So let's get into a couple of these issues, all right? So we think that the reason why we have a government is not simply, and why we have democracy rather, is not simply to allow for people to have their preferences represented. That's the assumption that opening government gives us, and we don't think that that's entirely accurate. We think that the reason why we have representative democracies is to achieve 2 separate ideals. Number 1, yes, we agree that people's preferences are important to be represented. But number 2, we think that often it needs to be the case that some group of individuals take hardline decisions against people's preferences when that decision is not in their best interests. So we look at a whole bunch of issues, right? We look at things like going to war, which we think is sometimes necessary and sometimes is an unpopular decision that a government needs to take that the populace would be unwilling to take. More than that, we look in Europe, right, where we've got austerity policies. And we know these have been defined out because, we're not talking about expertise-based decisions. But the fact of the matter is, the principle here indicates to us that often what people think is in their best interests is completely different from what is in their best interests. And they tend to vote along what their preferences are, not what their interests are. And finally, we look at what we've got in my own country, in South Africa, where there is a preference for pushing foreigners out of the country, right? The kinds of social issues you're talking about, immigration policy, right? We think that's a particularly dangerous thing, because we think in a lot of instances those foreigners bring jobs, bring job creation, and we think that government is the only entity that can recognize the broad social implications of that kind of policy. Yes, sir?
So when are we supposed to do the things that are consistent with what the people want, and when are we supposed to do things that are the exact opposite? You just assume that for some reason the legislators know how to divide those situations?
So, we think the reason why elected representatives are preferable to determining when it is acceptable to do what the people want is because we think that elected representatives exist to do 2 contradictory things at the same time. Number 1, we think that what elected representatives do is magnify particular social issues by delivering them in a single coherent voice. We think that often the problem with society is that you've got a lot of different preferences that need to be represented, and no single uniting line. We think that this is what politicians can do particularly well and elected representatives do particularly well. But more than that, we also think that what politicians do is that they can recognize when that particular majority-based decision strays into some kind of tyranny of the majority, which we think is not the same as under a representation based on the analysis that opening opposition has given to you already. So we think that governments ought to exist to act in people's best interests, not just simply to represent them. And more than that, we just don't think that people are often in the best position to represent themselves, because we don't think that it's acceptable to allow people to dictate the agenda of government. Often because we don't trust the people to make those kinds of decisions, right? Because we think that side government lives in a world, right, that's pretty much American, and maybe particularly unique in that regard. We think they live in the kind of world where gay marriage now suddenly has a majority, but in many societies around the world, particularly the kinds of societies I live in and I experience on a daily basis, do not, right? More than that, even in your own society, that issue has not been one that existed till very, very recently, and has not been one that's been bought into by the majority of people. Further than that, what we gave you in a point of information very, very early on was to say that we don't ever accept that it's okay to allow people to make decisions on the basis of a whim, right? And we think that the problem with allowing referenda is that when you give people the kind of binary decision, a yes-no, in something that has not up till this point been discussed, we think that people don't make decisions based on any form of informed considerations, because we think 2 things happen. Number 1, the exact same kinds of lobbyist groups that you're so worried about in government change the perspective of their lobbying towards lobbying individual people to take a particular stance at a referendum. That's often what happens. But more than that, we just don't think that people bother to try and educate themselves about these issues. They tend to hold issues, like views, that the majority of their community holds, because it's held by their minister, it's held by their rabbi. We don't think that people engage in the kind of critical way that you guys believe. And finally, right, we don't believe that it's ever acceptable to allow people we don't ever say it's acceptable to allow people to say, or to give people the ability to have a say up until the point at which that's not acceptable, right? Because we think that a lot of social grievances exist when that kind of policy is implemented. We think one of the major problems with the policy presented by the opening government, particularly in still allowing courts to overrule decisions that they think are unconstitutional and wrong, is that what you've done is you've given the people the ability to legitimize the view that they have by saying, look, the majority of us agree with policy X, even if that policy X is unconstitutional. We think it's problematic to then allow a different body, an unelected and unaccountable body, to then overturn that kind of decision. We think that's the kind of thing that leads to social anxiety, leads to people losing buy-in into the system. And we think, therefore, that your policy only works where it's good. That's not a reason to implement a policy, Mr. Speaker, because what we do as the opposition side of the House is protect people's ability to protect themselves when things go bad, and we give them the ability to protect themselves when things go well. I'm very proud to oppose on those grounds.
I thank the Speaker for his speech, and to close the case of the government, the House recognises the government whip.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The closing opposition seems somewhat shocked by the concept of courts based on the last argument that they just made, which is to say, oh, it's this terrible, terrible thing to have a group of people who say, oh, this is what we want the law to be, and if it's viewed to be inconsistent with some constitution, that's overturned. That process is completely fine. That process is a normal democratic process in which we believe that we follow the will of the people, except we don't follow in instances which is an unacceptable side constraint decided by some kind of enormous majority when it comes to the Constitution. That is the way that a democratic system works. The problem with the sort of quasi-democratic system that we get advocated for on the opposition is it's one that proxies through the legislatures, even though they are fundamentally flawed in an enormous number of situations, and the flaws of those legislatures aren't actually sufficiently dealt with by the opposition. So, let's deal with two broad issues in this debate. The first question is which approach is more consistent with the deep democratic goals of the populations we're dealing with, and the second is which allows for the legislation itself that the actual outcomes that we're most looking forward to. Now, we say on side government that in fact the only way to have a democratic government is one which extends the will of the people. That is to say, the reason why there are legislatures is that it's a proxy for the will of the people. At some point, it becomes complicated to deal with decisions here and there, things that are too complex, and so we say that some legislatures are chosen to implement the policies that are consistent with what the people have. On the other side, what we hear is this version that says, well, we want the will of the people most of the time, except when the will of the people is abstract wrong. And if the will of the people is wrong, then we can sort of get rid of the tyranny of the majority, because the will of the people which chose the representatives would have representatives that decided at some point the will of the people is no longer legitimate. This makes no sense, because it doesn't make sense to say that these legislators get to decide when we should say, oh, let's do the will of the people, and let's do the opposite of the will of the people. Now, the only semblance of a justification we get is, well, hey, these legislators have multiple different goals. Yeah, we would argue they have multiple different goals. Goal number one is to, in some way, represent the people. And goal number two is to save their hide in their own political party so they continue to get elected again and again, as opposed to do the things which are what the people who elected them actually want as the outcomes. Yes?
Look, the issue with the House is where a critical mass of people exists who is moderate and is willing to back the kind of things you want, party lines are not static and can shift to reflect that. Where this critical mass doesn't exist, a ballot initiative doesn't solve anything.
Okay, so if there's a massive critical mass of people who support this, it's much easier to get the funding to put something on the ballot and get the people to vote in favor. The problem is that the structure of most political systems means that even if you have a group of moderates who are in general support of an idea, those things don't get passed in the legislators. Why? Because those moderates don't end up donating the massive amounts of money that are actually necessary to pass things, that those moderates, even if they have some kind of subjective belief are influenced by lobbyists who are paid by large corporations who decide the legislation, who end up writing the legislation itself. This, by the way, is particularly important, right? Because you say like, hey, we've got all sorts of ballots which are complicated and worded in lots of different ways. Yeah, but who are the people who are wording legislation itself? They're not the legislators, they're the lobbyists wording those legislation, which means the influence there is far stronger when it comes from not the will of the people itself. So the problem is that the nature of the political system, in which the only people who get things passed are those who are willing to hold the party line at all times, regardless of what's going on, who are willing to aggregate massive amounts of money from special interests, those are the ones who actually pass pieces of legislation, as opposed to other instances. Our policy is one that allows you to access the will of the people in those individual circumstances. So, when it comes to the question of what's more consistent with the democratic rules, there is no clear explanation as to why we sometimes follow the will of the people and why we sometimes don't follow the will of the people. If we believe that the role is to follow the will of the people, we're okay to have legislatures in times in which we think they may resolve issues of complication. But that is not true in cases in which it's a specific moral question being resolved in one way or another. And many of the examples, for example, we get are not cases or things that relate to the courts, because there are things like, what do you believe about the death penalty should be expanded, should the death penalty be eliminated, all things which can perfectly happen through the process of legislation. So, we say that it's more consistent to have the role of the people and the people vote themselves when it comes to those decisions. But let's deal with the second issue of debate, which is what's more consistent in actually getting active, positive legislation and to implement the outcomes we want. There are a number of different arguments that explain why the political system is fundamentally fractured and broken that are not sufficiently engaged with. The first of which is the party system, that it comes not only when it comes to the questions of money, but also when it comes to the legislative and agenda-setting notion of the party system. That is to say, that those people who are controlled literally decide the things which come before the floor of the parliament, which means that even if you are a minority party that has some kind of support in one way or another, unless you have a majority on all issues, it doesn't matter if you have like a majority of support on one issue, because the truth is the party which has the majority still won't break their lines in any case, even if some people disagree with the internal party in some ways. Yes?
So the reason courts don't solve the problems we've talked about is beyond being those cultural elites you guys seem close to. The problem is that courts, there may be things that are constitutional but still aggregate people's moral autonomy, which may still be an incentive that legislators do have to care about to get reelected, but the average citizen does not.
Okay, so you say legislators need to care about to get reelected. That is completely the wrong goal. There is no reason justified whatsoever as to why we care about legislators following the legislation, which is not what the people voted now, but what they suspect some other group of people, if they end up running in a different district at some other time, those people will support them, right? The goal is to say the people want X now, and we support the actual actions that those people have asked for. There's no theory of representation that is consistent with this idea that says, look, we're paid attention to what's happening in later future elections. So, the legislative system is fundamentally broken. It's broken because the party system doesn't actually allow people who have majorities to get the policies that they want. And because even if those policies were able to come up on the ballots generically, the truth is that those things would be massively influenced by lobbyists, those people who would control the legislation one way or another, right? This, after all, is a comparative debate. So when we look at the influence of each of those things on the legislator versus the influence of them on ballots themselves, it's enormous, the difference between them, right? What's the funding differential that happens? We believe there's a problem with money in politics. It exists so much more when you have to pay millions and millions to control the legislature, as opposed to it's much easier in terms of funding to get things on the ballot. When it comes to the influence of lobbyists and experts in one way or another and their individual bias, it's far, far easier to have those people who are incredibly powerful influence the legislature, as opposed to a case in which lots of people who are themselves making decisions about what they want ultimately voting, right? So if lobbyists get to write the legislation, then it is far better to have the people be able to vote up or down on the legislation itself, as opposed to for them to generically say, like, I want a representative who supports this idea, and then some backroom deal happens inside where the ultimate result does not at all actually parallel the generic desire that they have themselves. So if you physically want them to be able to make the decision, it's far cheaper, it's far easier, and it's far more consistent with their physical goals, as opposed to this abstract concept of sometimes what the legislators want, unless they decide to override the people, because that sounds fun.
The next speaker for a speech and to conclude the case of the opposition, and James Paul much recognizes the opposition.
ladies and gentlemen, we as side opposition throughout this debate have had one clear problem with government side. And that is that the one main thing that they had to do in terms of their way between representative and direct democracies today was show us where the accountability mechanism fails in a current representative democracy, right? What they had to do was come up and show us why, under the current systems, representative democracy is not good enough, and that when the people want a certain thing and want a certain piece of legislation passed, they cannot force government to do this because somehow they are unable to force parties to change. We as opposition say that your desire for your party to be furthered is primarily through a mechanism of winning the approval of the people. That is the first way that you actually get elected, right? That is the basic line. What we say is that in terms of the concerns about extremism and moderating society, we always side with the fact that political parties have to achieve, in order to get elected, the approval of the most people, right? In terms of an analysis of minorities, what we would say is that aside from the fact that minorities just don't win referenda, so we don't see the from government side the analysis that minorities would be greater franchised and greater supported and greater presented under their system. We see, in fact, a far more likely situation of the sort of examples which weren't engaged with from my first speaker, Tristan, like the example in South Africa about corrective rape, or the example of Uganda about homosexuality being sinful and morally abhorrent and worthy of death. What we would say rather is that in a representative democracy, you have a greater incentive and need to appeal to the minorities. Why? Because in terms of marginal victories in an election, you need that support to flip over to the 51% from the 49%. We see under representative democracies a far greater likelihood of an appeal to the sort of people that government are trying to protect under our model, under the status quo. We haven't seen any ideas why that's not true. This debate is very much in terms of the whole world, not just in terms of America. We still haven't got any of that analysis. Sadly, we can't now. I'm the last speaker. Okay, cool. So, aside from the fact that they didn't show us what was wrong with current representative democracy, we had an outstanding case from opening opposition to show us this incredible way up between representative and direct democracies, right? The only real damaging claim that we got was about extremism in political parties. We got the problem that maybe people will have to go by a party line, and so might, in the case of Republicans, seeing as everybody's obsessed with America because we're here, essentially be anti-abortion. But what we would say is that, again, it is far more likely that you are going to be elected under a normal multi-party system as opposed to the polarization than if you appeal to the people, and in the analysis I've already given, actually appeal to the people who are going to get you elected. Sure, why not?
Okay, I want to concede that a consequence of our policy may be that gay marriage laws, for example, in any place, might not be passed as quickly. But more important than passing laws on social issues is that they are genuinely undergirded by social acceptance. We incentivize changing minds. We told you that out of my PM speech. Your side doesn't. Explain why that is.
Thank you. Okay, on the first level, we've already given you the powerful analysis of political whim, right? We see the change in opinions on gay marriage. But on a secondary level, what we would say is there is a difference in expertise. You can't just as openly government stand up and say that we're talking about the death penalty, and we're talking about gay marriage, and we're talking about immigration policy because it's not concerning expertise. We still say that the legislature needs to have that power, needs to have that influence, and they are elected because they have the expertise and are in the best positions to make powerful decisions. As I'm going to go on to now, our powerful line as closing was quite simply that we elect people because they can make decisions while in the people's best interest, not just on preference. That is the line that we hold as side opposition. Okay, so as I was saying before the point of information, we had a powerful case about accountability. We had the talk about political expertise. We had the idea that you need to compromise. What the government side hasn't recognized is that you don't get these crazy extremist ideas because you have a double level of accountability in a representative democracy. First, you need to get elected through popular will of the people, but then you actually need to make compromise in parliament, right? You need to make compromise with other parties who have vested interests because of how they've been represented and the interests that they've been represented. You need to engage with that, right? So then we had this. So then we had this idea about, okay, cool, sorted, done that. Okay, cool. So what did we get from Tristan in terms of our closing opposition extension? What we first said was that governments are in a better position than individuals in terms of creating the best interest for everybody, right? What we simply find is that in terms of hard, difficult decisions which require expertise, things like war, things like difficult things like that, we don't think that the people are in the best interest, right? What we also got was analysis from opening our opposition which said that we shouldn't trust people who don't have a direct tie and a direct interest in the decision being made, and might not even have the information that we need to make a powerful decision at all. So what we have is a strong line from the whole of opposition's bench to say that actually we would rather prefer governments to make decisions like this, right? Okay, so then we have a second level where we say that we shouldn't allow the people to dictate the agenda, right? We shouldn't at all times accept popular will. We had powerful analysis from just an example to say that there simply are countries with cultures beyond America which simply have different views, and we should uphold constitutionality and the power of that first and foremost, right? But on a third level, and this is in direct response to the reply from government whip speaker where he simply said that courts are overarching and all powerful. What we said was, and this is critical, is that in terms, and I'll take it in a second, in terms of legitimacy, you can't be telling the people that they have all powerful legitimacy and all power, and then suddenly arbitrarily in an unelected body, which might not have the same legitimacy from the people, actually saying, actually no, you don't have that legitimacy, we're going to restrict you in that sense. We don't believe that that's good for social cohesion, for the buy-in that they were seeking. We would stand for the government to make decisions. So,
if people are too stupid or too apathetic to make the right decisions, why will they be good at choosing other people to override their own stupid will?
Well, so quite simply, what we see is firstly the analysis from opposition that we can get a coherent set of ideals for a positive outcome, right, in a representative process. But secondly, what we would say is that we just think that if they're too stupid or too apathetic, then exactly, we don't want them to have such a great overarching power. We would rather allow the legislature to make those decisions, give them the power to do those things. They've been elected for those reasons. Let's support them on that. Ladies and gentlemen, what have we got in today's debate? Quite simply, what we have so far is a government who failed to do the basic thing that they needed to do. To say that we don't have the accountability that we need, we don't have the sort of legitimacy that we need. I'd like to take you back to the very beginning of the debate when Prime Minister said that legitimacy in a democracy is based on when people in a democracy believe that the institutions are legitimate. We have seen that legitimacy in a representative democracy. We have shown you why in terms of the process, in terms of good decision making, representative democracies are better. We certainly see no reason for the other way. Opposition must win.
Cool. I thank all the speakers for that debate. You know the group by now. If you sort of wonder how to call you back to this, you can.
You were there to be available to answer. Make sure his hands are washed before you say it.
Thanks so much.